Well, welcome all. Welcome to this Building the Bridge event to launch the Arms-Related Risk Analysis Toolkit, practical guidance for integrating conventional arms-related risks into conflict analysis and prevention. My name is Simon Yazgi. I am a senior advisor with the United Nations Integrated Transitional Assistance Mission in Sudan, but also a senior fellow with UNIDIR, where I worked, amongst other things, on the toolkit. As we have shortened the name of this document to. Participating in this meeting are representatives from UN entities, including field presences, states, regional organizations, and civil society. And I believe we had about 180 people who had signed up for this. I can't see if everyone's here yet, but I hope you are, and a warm welcome to you. Let me start by a small apology. Our neighbor rather inconsiderately decided to start some work on their apartment this morning. So I hope that the banging in the background won't be too distracting. But we're pleased to have everyone join through UNIDIR's Building the Bridge initiative. This aims to promote dialogue amongst peace, security, and development actors on the way to apply conventional arms control to reduce violence, prevent armed conflict, and advance sustainable development. Today's event is intended to serve as a first of a series to promote UNIDIR's research on the integration of conventional arms control into conflict prevention and management and prevention of recurrence of conflict. And the Arms-Related Risk Analysis Toolkit that we're launching is one of the outputs of this development that we look forward to discussing with you today and in future events. We will today discuss the importance of examining arms-related risk in conflict analysis, or incorporating it into conflict analysis, and the challenges and opportunities of doing so. We often talk about conflict prevention, management, and resolution. We often talk about the use of weapons, especially small arms and light weapons or conventional arms in conflict, but too seldom are the two linked. So we hope that this launch event of the toolkit will stimulate discussion, debate, and feedback on this subject, and that the toolkit itself will provide a practical guide for doing exactly what we like, which is to integrate arms control into conflict analysis and the prevention of conflicts. Today's event will be in several parts. We will start with an introduction to the toolkit by my colleague, Erica Mumford. We'll then have a moderated discussion amongst the experts with us today, who I'll introduce in a minute. And they will talk about the benefits and challenges of integrating arms control into conflict analysis, and how the UN system might leverage the toolkit to strengthen prevention interventions. And we hope how this might be used beyond the UN by other actors. So special thanks to the experts who are joining us. I'll introduce them as we go into the second part of this session. I'd like to extend our thanks to our partners who have been involved in this endeavor and who have supported it. This includes the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Department of Peace Operations, the Office for Disarmament Affairs, and the United Nations Development Programme. But also, and just as importantly, if not more so, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude to the governments who supported our research in the Conventional Arms Programme, and in particular on the programme of integrating conventional arms control into conflict prevention and management, which includes Ireland, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the UK. And special thanks to the UK, who will provide opening remarks in a minute that will be delivered by Mrs. Simon Cleobury, who's with us today. He is a Deputy Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament of the United Kingdom mission to the UN in Geneva. So welcome, Simon, and thank you. Before we get started, just a quick couple of administrative remarks. We will be having presentations, but we would like to hear from the wider floor about your experiences in this field and any thoughts and comments you may have on the toolkit and how you might see yourselves using this. So we will open the floor to questions and answers as a part of the second part of this event, and we'd encourage everyone to use the questions and answer function to post your comments and questions so that we can then choose those that we will put to the panelists. We'll keep time management in mind, so it may be that we will not be able to get to everyone's questions, and I apologize in advance if that's the case. But if we can facilitate an engagement post-seminar, we would also do so. In case we have any issues with the Zoom meeting, we have a backup link ready. And if something were to happen and we had to cut the meeting, we will send you an email with a new link to rejoin the meeting. The meeting is being recorded. It will be made available on UNIDIR's website following the event, so this will be made public. However, we would ask that you do not quote the event or the participants in the event without taking their permission and that of UNIDIR. So if you would like to provide a quote from this event or use a quote from this event, please contact UNIDIR, and we will then be in touch with the panelists or others who are being quoted to make sure that they're okay with this. With these few remarks, I would like to thank you again for joining us and hand the floor to Mr. Simon Cleobury of the UK for his opening remarks. Simon, over to you. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed, and very good afternoon, good morning, good evening to colleagues, and thank you for joining us today for what is, well, certainly for me personally, it's a very exciting day to see this toolkit launched. This is a work stream that I have been involved with since the start, and something that I have personally championed through the UK system. And to see this toolkit being launched today by UNIDIR is a really great moment. So I'm thrilled about that. I'm also very pleased that you asked me to say a few words to get us going today. So let me start by saying a few words about UNIDIR's work and about the toolkit. The proliferation of conventional arms and ammunition, as we all know, drives conflicts, fuels crime and terrorism, and undermines virtually all peace, security, and development goals. The effective control of conventional arms and ammunition must play a wider part in UN conflict prevention and management. That is the heart of what we're trying to do here. And arms control measures play a vital role in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 16, to promote just, peaceful and inclusive societies. That's why the UK has been pleased to contribute to UNIDIR's workstream on integrating conventional arms control into conflict prevention and management, through which the development and launch of this toolkit was made possible. For us, the toolkit is a key deliverable from our funding, and fundamental to achieving our goal of mainstreaming arms control considerations within the UN's conflict prevention and management efforts. The objective of the research on integrating conventional arms control into conflict prevention and management is to strengthen existing UN approaches and practices, and to identify new means and methods to effectively integrate conventional arms control into conflict prevention, management, and resolution efforts. In addition, this research seeks to increase understanding of the impact of illicit arms and ammunition in facilitating and prolonging armed conflict. A few words on the research that UNIDIR has been doing. Arms control remains, as I've just said, arms control remains a key component in preventing armed conflict and sustaining peace. However, UNIDIR's research has revealed that despite the various efforts undertaken to integrate conventional arms control into UN conflict prevention and management work, implementation remains uneven. While conflict prevention and management practitioners may have access to information for supporting conventional arms control, they do not systematically integrate arms control measures into their conflict prevention and management toolbox. But the effective use of arms control in support of conflict prevention will require not just overcoming these obstacles, but also adapting the existing range of arms control measures and activities to new realities of violence and conflict. The UK has been a strong advocate of UN system reform, and one of the reasons why we decided to fund this work was to ensure a more joined up approach by all those working on conflict prevention and management across the UN system, and also to try and join up New York and Geneva more in this work. The findings of the UNIDIR research tell us that we were right to call for this more integrated approach and to fill this gap in the way that UN does conflict prevention and management. The UK is encouraged by UNIDIR's efforts to foster this more coherent approach by the UN system, and we fully support the Building the Bridge initiative that brings together the arms control and conflict prevention communities, bringing them together. It's so important to explore how to apply arms control activities and tools across a conflict life cycle. Just a little bit of history as to kind of why we're here today. In order for the UN's conflict prevention work to be effective, it's essential that arms and ammunition related risks and their impact on societies are adequately understood and assessed. UNIDIR's research workstream was initiated in response to the UN Secretary General's call in his 2018 Agenda for Disarmament for the integration of conventional arms control into UN conflict prevention and management activities. And in particular, the development of this toolkit responds to Action 21 of the Agenda for Disarmament, which looks to explore how to better integrate an understanding of the impact of arms into assessments, risk analyses, and conflict prevention activities. And the SG's Agenda for Disarmament also acknowledges the potential benefits of applying existing conventional arms control tools more effectively. It was the UK and Switzerland working through what we called the Geneva Peace and Security Group that we established in 2018 that called for what became Action 21 in the SG's agenda. Therefore, I'm very pleased to see the work that UNIDIR is doing to implement this action. The UK is a champion of this action, and we're very pleased to see UNIDIR providing important resources and tools to support practitioners working in UN mandated missions, as well as in non-mission settings as well. Finally, to commend to you all that the launch of this toolkit. The toolkit provides guidance on how to better integrate conventional arms and ammunition related risks into the UN's conflict analysis work. The toolkit is a practical instrument to support peace and security, development, and humanitarian actors in conflict-affected and fragile settings to better understand and identify arms-related risks across the conflict continuum. In turn, applying the toolkit can support the establishment of a comprehensive conflict prevention strategies that consider the role of arms and ammunition in prolonging or facilitating instability and armed violence. The UK commends the launch of the toolkit today and looks forward to supporting its dissemination and uptake within the UN system and beyond, we hope. The uptake of the toolkit will strengthen understanding of the risks and impacts of arms and how conventional arms control can contribute to conflict prevention, management, and resolution thinking and measures. So in closing, I'll say once again how excited we are to be launching the toolkit today. We hope it will be a practical, helpful tool for practitioners across the spectrum of work on conflict prevention. We as a donor, we're very keen to hear from practitioners on what you think of the toolkit, and particularly examples of where it has had an impact. So with that, I'll finish and thank UNIDIR once again for inviting me to speak today, and for all your great work in bringing us to this point in launching the toolkit. And I very much look forward to hearing from the other panelists and from those of you who are listening in today on what you think of this new product. And with that, back to you, Simon. Thank you.
Simon, thanks for that. Thank you to you personally. As Simon mentioned, he was a part of the, he was a large part of the sort of driving force behind not only the toolkit, but the wider program that is a part of this. So it's great to have you here in what is an important milestone in this project, and is a milestone because it is a step on a longer sort of path. And As Simon mentioned, we now have the toolkit out. The important thing will be to see how it is taken up and how it is used. And as we will discuss a little bit later, how we can help to refine it and make it a better product for those of you out there who are actually working on conflict prevention. But I don't want to steal the thunder of our next presenter, Erica, who is a colleague from UNIDIR and one of the lead authors of the toolkit. And Erica will provide us a presentation on the toolkit so that for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it yet, you have a better understanding of what it involves, how it works, and how it may assist you in your work. Thank you very much, Erica. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining. So I will be presenting an introductory presentation on the Arms-Related Risk Analysis Toolkit. And to start, I'll say a few words briefly about UNIDIR. So UNIDIR is an autonomous institution within the United Nations that conducts independent research on disarmament and related international security issues. And since 2019, UNIDIR's conventional arms and ammunition program has been conducting research on integrating conventional arms control into conflict prevention and management. And if we go to the next slide, we can see our work also aims to improve the understanding of the risks and impact of arms and how conventional arms control can be used to support conflict prevention, management, and resolution. Next slide, please. And conventional disarmament and arms control has served many purposes, and all of which have greatly supported the UN's work to prevent and resolve conflict. And the Security Council has recalled that a comprehensive conflict prevention strategy should include measures throughout the peace continuum and recognizes that measures taken before, during, or after a conflict are interdependent and complementary and can take place in a non-linear manner. And so the UN also makes use of different prevention tools at different stages of a conflict, and these can be paired with arms control tools. And if we click next, we can see that there are also a range of arms control tools which can be used at different stages of a conflict. And these can be used to end a conflict as part of a peace agreement or a ceasefire negotiation, and to secure the peaceful resolution of a conflict. And arms control can also be used to promote transparency, confidence, and stability at different levels. And this can support reducing tensions and supporting a peaceful end to a conflict. And UNIDIR's research has explored how arms control tools can be used at the different stages of a conflict. And we found that while there's a heavy emphasis on arms control in post-conflict settings, there's less attention given to upstream prevention settings and how different measures can be used before a conflict breaks out. Next slide, please. And some of the challenges have been mentioned already by Simon, but UNIDIR's research has found that the work of the UN does not fully and systematically integrate arms control into conflict mediation and prevention efforts. And this is also recognized by the Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament. And we have a number of reasons why this is a challenge. And among them, we can see limited understanding of how to analyze and interpret the effect of arms on a conflict. And there's also limited awareness of how achieving disarmament objectives can also complement the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly. And this is also complemented by the lack of arms control and related information in conflict analysis frameworks that are used, which leads to a limited understanding of the role that arms can play. And next slide, please. And with these challenges in mind, UNIDIR's Arms-Related Risk Analysis Toolkit was designed in response and to overcome some of these challenges. It does this by providing a framework of risk areas and indicators, as well as guidance and a simple process that can support in integrating data and metrics into analyses. And there are 3 tools which can be used throughout a process of preparing or conducting for an analysis. In the first step, you can select from a range of risk areas and risk factors, depending on a specific context and the needs of your analysis. And this could then lead to the second step, when an analyst can use the risk factor selector tool to help narrow down more specific risks, which are the most relevant. And finally, the information sources compendium tool offers a non-exhaustive list of information sources, and this can be used to support the collection of data and monitoring the metrics that were selected. And the use of the toolkit can be adapted to different types of analyses, and also can be used in different levels when different levels of information are available or different types of analysis is needed. And while the toolkit can support or complement existing conflict analysis frameworks, it is not the goal to replace a conflict analysis. Next slide, please. And the Arms-Related Risk Analysis tool is the main component of the toolkit, which captures the key features of the presence and use of weapons and helps to consider the implications of arms on a conflict. And we have a menu of options to choose from, provided by the different risk areas. And these have been kept simple and as non-technical as possible. And we hope this allows people without a background in arms control to access this information more easily and make this more accessible to a wide audience. And we also considered cross-cutting factors in the toolkit and provide guidance on how to combine different factors in an analysis. Next slide, please. And the 5 risk areas represent the overarching framework for assessing risks. And these look at what can be inferred and understood from the type of weapons and ammunition, who is holding them, how they are used in a conflict, and how this can influence the trajectory of a conflict or shape the type of actors involved. And the first risk area is considering the proliferation of arms and what the presence of arms might mean as to the likelihood of a conflict. There is also channels of access, looking at acquisition of weapons, as this can be one of the prerequisites for an armed group forming, and also exploring civilian and different armed actors' access to weapons. The third risk area explores the use of arms during a conflict and how this can impact the escalation or de-escalation and changes in military capability of armed actors or changes in tactic while a conflict is ongoing. And the fourth risk area explores how armed violence related factors in post-conflict settings or even arms and their impact on crime. And lastly, the fifth risk area looks at weapons and ammunition management, and this can be considered at any stage of a conflict. The risk areas look at capacity to prevent illicit arms transfers, prevent diversion, illicit trafficking, and illicit possession of weapons. And if we click next, we can also see that we have risk factors and risk points, which can be used to further narrow down these groups of risk areas. Next slide, please. And so in addition to the main tool, we have two complementary tools that can support an analysis. The risk factor selector tool guides analysts in choosing the most appropriate risk factors based on different parameters, including different stages of a conflict, the geographic scope of a conflict, and the parameters, including the type of actors involved, intensity, and the likelihood that a conflict will break out. We have the information sources compendium tool, which provides a very comprehensive list of approximately 200 information sources. And this tool provides open and accessible sources. And we hope this can help to overcome the challenges which were mentioned in accessing information on arms. And however, this list is non-exhaustive. And so we encourage analysts to consider additional sources, especially at the country level, which are more difficult to include. Next slide, please. And so who is the toolkit for? We predominantly designed the toolkit for UN departments, offices, and programs, and corresponding field presences tasked with conflict prevention, as well as other actors undertaking conflict analysis in any form. This can be directly related to conflict prevention, such as the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, or peripheral to it, such as some UN country teams and humanitarian country teams, which might inform humanitarian interventions. And there is also a priority put on upstream prevention, and the risk indicators should be used as part of conflict analysis taking place before a dispute has turned into an armed conflict, and this can inform upstream prevention strategies. And we also recognize the importance to increase the conflict analysis capacity of UN resident coordinators and country teams, which are often the least well-resourced to undertake this task. And understanding these challenges, the toolkit was developed for use with minimal resources and should be suited for all UN and non-UN actors undertaking a conflict analysis. Next slide, please. And so it's very important that arms-related risks and impact are not seen in isolation, and they should always be understood as part of the broader security, political, and economic context. And while arms shape and facilitate armed violence, they do not always drive it on their own. In this way, the toolkit considers that arms and ammunition can be both a predictor and a sustainer of armed violence, as well as considered as either structural or proximate causes or factors of a conflict. And for example, an analyst might look for evidence of a militarized society, the mix of guns or arms proliferation, in addition to tense elections or another conflict trigger. And applying a conventional arms lens should not replace existing assessment and programming tools, but the toolkit is rather designed to complement existing conflict analysis data points and help bring in new elements of information. And lastly, to conclude, the toolkit is considered a working document, and we encourage everyone who uses it to provide feedback. And we have included a link to a feedback form inside the toolkit as well as in the chat. And we would greatly appreciate feedback on how the toolkit is received to help improve the relevance of the toolkit in the future. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and time today. And we hope that the toolkit can stimulate the discussions during this event. And I'll hand back the floor to Simon.
Thank you, Erica. I realized that during the presentation, we had a question on whether we could share the toolkit. My understanding is, the presentation, you should have the link to the toolkit in the chat already. My understanding is yes, and we will try and do that either during the seminar or afterwards for those of you who'd like it. Erica, thank you very much for that presentation. I think there are, it's very important to see this as a step in the right direction, I hope, in integrating arms control and conflict prevention. We do believe that the use and the proliferation of weapons is a factor in armed conflict. In fact, without arms, there is no armed conflict, there is simply conflict. But as Erica mentioned, we see this also as only one factor, and this should not be looked at in isolation from all the other issues that we might consider as we look at conflict prevention. I'd also like to say, although, and I know this point was made, but although that the toolkit was very much developed with the UN in mind, I know we have a lot of colleagues who are not from the UN or people who are not from the UN joining us today. Please rest assured it is equally useful for you, we hope, and we would love to hear your feedback on this as well. It was developed, I would say, as a part of a request from the Secretary General of the UN, as was mentioned by Simon and Erica. But we did try to make sure that it would be usable by everyone. And in fact, as was said, attempt to make it used by those who even don't have a very strong or a very deep background in arms control. So to make it as simple as possible for all to use that. We'll now move on to sort of the next phase of the event, which is a discussion. And I'm very glad to be joined by three presenters who will be with us today, who are going to discuss the benefits and challenges of integrating arms control lens into conflict analysis and prevention, and how they see us leveraging toolkits, both within the UN system and beyond, to strengthen conflict prevention, management, and resolution. We'll take them one at a time, and I will give a couple of minutes if you have questions for the presenters after each presentation. So please post those questions using the Q&A function. But first, a quick introduction of three experts and friends who are present today. First, Miguel Burihabwa, who is a political affairs officer in the Central Africa team of the Central and Southern Africa Division of Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations in the United Nations. Gal, welcome from New York. Thanks for joining us this morning, I believe it is. We have Nils Anders, who is Chief Analyst on Terrorism in the Joint Mission Analysis Center, JMAC, in the UN Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA. And Florence Foster, who is the representative for peace and disarmament at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. Welcome to all, and thank you for taking the time this afternoon. I suggest we move straight on to the first presenter, which will be Miguel. Miguel, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the introduction. And let me begin by congratulating UNIDIR for this timely initiative and very useful product, and also to thank you, Simon, Erica, and colleagues for inviting me as panelist to this event. So my intervention will be made from a perspective of the United Nations Peace and Security Architecture. And if we could have the presentation up, so that colleagues that might not be so familiar with the UN system and its structures can see what I'm referring to. So the United Nations Peace and Security Architecture encompasses three main structures. First, the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, DPPA, then the Department of Peace Operations, DPO, and three shared regional regional pillars, which cover 3 regions: Middle East, Asia, and Pacific, Africa, and Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas. And it is also important to note that the Department of Political Peacebuilding Affairs and the Department of Peace Operations are also providing guidance and backstopping support to UN peace operations and other presences across the globe. So if we could move to the second slide, please. So you will see here in different color coding the special political missions and other political presences in dark blue and green, which are managed by the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And you will also see in light blue the peacekeeping operations that are being managed by the Department of Peace Operations. Thank you. If we could go back to the first slide. Thanks. So the reason why I'm basically giving this intervention from that perspective is, of course, based on my current function within the DPPA DPO Central and Southern Africa Division, where I work on political affairs, but also my previous role in the Department of Peace Operations, Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions, where I worked primarily on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR. So moving to the first question, which is why it is important to examine arms-related risk and conflict analysis from a peace and security architecture perspective, the answer to this is quite simple, and it's actually manifested in the rationale of UNIDIR's project, namely that conventional arms and ammunition are a key instrument used to create and maintain conflict and insecurity. And it just so happens that the region of Central Africa, which I'm currently focusing on, seems to be a case in point of how this reality can play out in different ways. So we have, for example, in the DRC and the Central African Republic, where the UN has deployed fully fledged peacekeeping operations, an armed conflict pitting governments against non-state armed groups, with conventional arms being the preferred weapon of choice on both sides. Other countries are facing low intensity and often geographically limited armed conflict, where conventional arms also play a key role. Cameroon and to a certain extent Chad come to mind in this regard. And even in countries where neither is the case, the often regional dimension of conflict in Central Africa means that countries that are at peace might nevertheless be affected by proliferation of arms amongst civilians and arms trafficking, which is often linked to other forms of criminal trafficking. But the issue is not just one that relates to unregulated conventional arms being in the hands of non-state armed groups, criminal organizations, and civilians, but also raises the question of how states themselves are managing their stockpiles. By way of example, it's been established that the majority of weapons and munitions held by armed groups in Eastern DRC originate from the arsenals of state security services. And one could also go as far as recalling the devastating explosions of military arms depots in Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo in 2012 and Bata in Equatorial Guinea in 2021, which left hundreds of people dead. And while these may not have triggered or exacerbated political turmoil and conflict, the implications from a humanitarian but also development perspective have been severe, including for the United Nations and its country teams in both settings. So there is a clear case to be made that conventional arms control considerations are highly relevant for conflict analysis, as well as conflict prevention and management activities by the UN through the UN peace and security architecture. So moving to the second question, what the main challenges for integrating arms-related risks into conflict analysis and prevention work are, I believe that there are two sets. There are endogenous factors, which are inherent to our organizational setup and culture within the UN, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have exogenous factors, which are basically, which relate to the context in which we are operating in. So maybe as one example of an external factor, given that our work is always geared towards supporting national actors and national ownership, lacking capacities, but especially lacking willingness by our national counterparts to engage with the United Nations on arms control can be one key challenge. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, I would want to emphasize two challenges that are of internal nature. The first being that the political affairs sphere within the peace and security architecture, which leads on conflict analysis and prevention and management efforts, does not feature any specific expertise on arms control. So the likes of myself are not, in our senior management, are not experts on arms control. And quite frankly, we're not supposed to be experts on arms control. However, this fact can lead to a tendency where conflict analysis, as well as the subsequent political and programmatic action stemming from this analysis, may not always adequately integrate arms control, conventional arms control considerations. Now, it is important, though, to acknowledge that within the peace and security architecture, we do have substantive divisions and sections whose work relate to conventional arms control. This is especially the case within the Department of Peace Operations, where we have the Office of Military Affairs, which has conventional arms control capacities, but also within the Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions, where we have the office, where we have areas covered such as mine action, police, DDR, SSR, justice and corrections. And looking at peace operations, you also have additional capacities there, such as the JMAC, and we'll hear more about that in subsequent presentations, as well as in some cases, even an arms embargo cell. However, a second challenge seems to be that while these resources feed into, of course, the conflict analysis, prevention and management work of the peace and security architecture, it seems that there is space to have a more systematic integration and involvement of capacities and resources on conventional arms control that are not housed within the peace and security architecture. So mainly I'm thinking, of course, of the Office for Disarmament Affairs as the custodians of UN arms control policy, with their regional centers, as well as UNIDIR as a very relevant research institution. And perhaps that there's also space to explore how the UN can better tap into some of the external capacities and resources when it comes to conventional arms controls. I'm thinking about the likes of Small Arms Survey, GICHD, AMAT, and others. So moving on to the third and final question of what the key entry points and opportunities for applying the toolkit to integrate assessments of conventional arms-related risks into conflict analysis and comprehensive conflict prevention, management and resolution strategies are. I think it is worthwhile to maybe take a step back and to look at what the entry points are to better integrate conventional arms-related or considerations into prevention, conflict prevention, conflict analysis, prevention and management activities before we look specifically at the toolkit. So in this regard, again, there are probably entry points that are of external nature and others that are of internal nature. I mentioned earlier the challenge of working with national authorities on arms control. I think from the experience in the Central African region, it's very interesting that given political sensitivities, it is difficult to work with national authorities on this. However, while they may not be willing to talk about the reasons why people decide to take up arms, or arms are circulating, basically political, socioeconomic grievances, etc., they are willing to acknowledge that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. And one entry point to do that are the existing international and regional arms control frameworks, in the case of Central Africa, especially the Kinshasa Convention, and to frame engagement with national authorities on arms control around support to the government in implementing in agreement, a convention that it has actually signed up to itself. But as I mentioned, probably looking within the UN system internally, there are also key entry points that need to be identified. The first being that it would be important to ensure that all stakeholders involved in conflict analysis, prevention, and management, especially within the peace and security architecture, as they lead on these efforts, are actually have a comprehensive understanding of the conventional arms control relevance, capacities, and resources. And that based on this, partnerships are explored to create synergies and to leverage comparative advantages of different system actors, which could then result in a systematic integration, mainstreaming of conventional arms across the peace continuum. And there are already some initiatives that are a first step into this direction. Maybe just to mention the DPO-ODA, joint DPO-ODA project on effective weapons and ammunition management in a changing DDR context that looks to systematically integrate arms control policy into peace operations practice on DDR, but also beyond. There's also the Saving Lives Entities partnership between ODA, UNDP, and PBSO, which looks at mainstreaming arms control into the work of United Nations country teams in non-mission settings, and actually Cameroon in the Central African region is one of the pilot projects here. And maybe also to mention the key role that an external partner, GICHG AMAT, played in the UN's response to the Bata explosion in 2021. So what does this mean specifically for the toolkit? I think it will be important for UNIDIR to sensitize the peace and security architecture, especially the political affairs desks and their leadership. Again, those who lead on these processes, on the rationale, the added value, and the application of this toolkit, and so that they understand that this is something that they can leverage for their work. And I think it will be important here to show how the data that is collected through the toolkit can be consolidated for political purposes. And furthermore, I believe it would be important for UNIDIR to work together with DPPA's Policy and Mediation Division, as well as DPO's Division for Policy Evaluation and Training, to see how the toolkit can complement or eventually maybe be integrated into the existing overarching conflict analysis and prevention frameworks, methodologies, and tools that we have as a UN system, namely strategic assessment missions and technical assessment missions that are deployed from this headquarters, mission concepts that are developed by UN peace operations on the ground, and also the common country analysis and UN Sustainable Development Cooperation frameworks that guide the work of United Nations country teams in non-mission settings. So I think I'll leave it here for now. Thank you very much, and looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Gail, thank you very much for that. It's nice to hear that that there are a number of initiatives already ongoing, and I hope that, as you say, that we can feed this into that, and the toolkit will be able to support some of those initiatives. Those who know the UN know that we don't always work or play very well together, but I'm glad to see that some of those boundaries are maybe being cut, certainly as regards arms control and integrating that into some of the conflict prevention work that we do, and glad to support that with it. I had said that those of you who'd like to could post questions in the chat box, sorry, in the questions and answers tool. At the moment, I see that there are no open questions for Gal, but maybe before I go on, I just was wondering, Gal, could you say a little bit, you mentioned that there is a sort of one of the problems that we face within the UN is that conflict analysis is often done by actors who are more on the political side. and who may sort of have less of an understanding of this. And, you know, what do you think we can do to raise awareness of the value and benefits of integrating conventional arms control into their work? And this is very much a part of the aim of this project, to build this bridge across I'd say the two sectors, the prevention actors and the arms control actors, and make sure that the knowledge, the experiences bleed across from one to the other.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I think it's really, first of all, the fact that, you know, the political affairs side of this house within the peace and security architecture leads on, you know, conflict analysis, prevention and management is the right thing, right? That's how it's supposed to be. The question is how to make sure that all relevant aspects and the required expertise can be, you know, can be fed into these processes. And I think, you know, this is again a question of, you know, integration within the system, but structures are one thing. I think it is important that those with the expertise, conventional arms expertise that are outside of the peace and security architecture, that they basically, you know, engage actor structures within the peace and security architecture and make their case. And especially, I think it's not necessarily always the fact that the actors in the peace and security architecture don't understand the relevance of, you know, arms control, etc. But sometimes there might also be a feeling that, you know, it's sensitive, it's complex, and it's put into the, you know, too hard to fix box, because maybe there's not an awareness that within our house, you know, within the organization, we have capacities, resources, experts that can, you know, support in making a sense of how, you know, the issue of conventional arms and ammunition affect the context in which we're working in, but also how, you know, we can actually do something about it programmatically, or just by, as mentioned, leveraging the international legal frameworks that exist and that these countries have signed up to. So I think it's a matter of really just meeting each other halfway, or moving, you know, making sure that beyond structures we try and work closer together.
Thank you. Thanks, Gil. We do have I noticed a question that's come up in the chat now, which is about the filtration of legal arms trade into conflict through bilateral trade agreements. I think this is quite a technical question, and what I might do is say, I hope Ariane, who posted, I hope you don't mind if we put this one aside for the moment, and maybe there are colleagues who might be able to get back to you with an answer on this. I think it's one that probably deserves more time and more thought than what our panelists might be able to address. Unless one of the panelists would like to have a go at this, or colleagues from UNIDIR, and we'll come back to it at the end of the presentations. But Gail, thank you very much for that, and thank you for your answers. The too hard to fix box, I think, rings a lot of bells as we were looking at some of the research for this. There is an understanding of the issue of, you know, arms are a problem, but then sort of it's accepted that they're a problem, I think largely because people don't really know what to do about it. So it is just seen as a fact of life almost. And I think that unfortunately means that it makes it very difficult to take a sort of a very comprehensive approach to conflict prevention, if that's the case. But I'm conscious of time, and therefore, if you don't mind, we'll move on, and would like to call upon our second panelist, Nils Holger Anders, who is joining us, I believe, from Bamako. Nils, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And as I was mentioned, I'm currently working for the UN mission here in Mali. I would like to clarify, though, that the presentation or the things I'm going to talk about are just my personal views. This is not a presentation by or on behalf of MINUSMA. So please keep that in mind. And talking about Mali, I think the situation there and some of the work we're trying to do is a good reflection of elements of the toolkit and how they can be used in practice by some UN actors. And on the situation in Mali, as you will know, it's complex with numerous armed actors. There are extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. There are ethnic-based militia, self-defense groups. There are national armed forces, signatory armed groups. All of these various actors are or may be involved in armed violence, some of it probably in violation of international humanitarian law and certainly also national law. And one of the challenges for the mission really is trying to see through the near daily attacks who is responsible for what, where do armed groups are moving, where are their supply lines coming from. And these are really elements that are covered by the toolkit in some of the brackets on identifying elements and trends that are ongoing. And some of the work we are doing specifically focuses on monitoring illicit arms flows and ammunition flows and seeing how that correlates to different groups in the country. One of the elements, of course, is that MINUSMA is facing regular attacks from extremist groups, either through small arms fire attacks or with improvised explosive devices or combinations thereof. And the mission very much tries to make sure that evidence that can be recovered from the sites of attacks against its personnel, its convoys, and its camps are collected in line with national legislation, are analyzed, and then handed over to national authorities for investigations at the national level. Why does it help the mission? One big element in that is certainly situational awareness, simply on the basis of trying to consistently collect such evidence and analyze this evidence. The mission has a fairly good idea of what is coming new into the country. We have a good idea of how certain actors are increasing their capacities, which may then also require a strengthening of defense measures by the mission. We are aware of new types of material coming in we haven't seen before. We are fully aware of trafficking flows through the sub-region, but also through capture at on the domestic battlefield. So many of these things are really about situational awareness, which the mission certainly has a need for. The second element is a contribution to the fight against impunity, against attacks, against peacekeepers. So one element still is, for example, despite the numerous attacks that have taken place against MINUSMA, there have been very few people apprehended, arrested, and tried for such crimes, presumably crimes once judged. And at least with the type of information the mission is able to provide the national authorities with, this has helped in individual cases, also in national law enforcement elements, exercises. So with the situational awareness and fight against impunity, I would certainly think this is part of the mission mandate. And specifically how this work is done, as I said, we collect cartridge cases after attacks have happened. We look at material that is seized in arms caches or that is found on apprehended individuals. All this information then is analyzed for categories of material, for their calibers, for their ages, for their types, for the designations. And by having done that now for a couple of years, as I said, we have a very good baseline in understanding how the situation is developing and what we may expect. At the same time, there remain, of course, challenges. The mission probably is only recovering a fraction of the material that could be recovered. Many of the reasons for that are internal and related to logistics, security situations, or indeed having personnel which can safely make judgment calls on the field of whether something is safe to be picked up or not. But I think another great hindrance to greater work in the areas of monitoring illicit arms and ammunition flows in the way that they impact host governments, host countries, and peacekeeping missions is that, at least in my opinion or experience, there may be a lot of uncertainty among decision makers within the mission here, but also in UN headquarters, about what type of action a mission can do, shouldn't do, what are the political implications, specifically if we were to take further, more proactive step of trying to actively investigate illicit arms transfers, or writing tracing requests or requests for information to producer countries in cases where material was found in, for example, extremist possession. All this work could be done, but there, as I said, at least to me, it seems there's a lot of uncertainty, and often decisions are made to not further engage into this work simply because there is no strategic guidance from higher up in the chain or more awareness. So all this then to say, the toolkit and some of the risk factors and the monitoring of these factors, I would certainly think for peacekeeping missions is spot on. Problem is, one, there may not be a lot of technical capacities, but more importantly, my feeling is that there isn't always a political buy-in, understanding of what type is possible and what the implications of this type of work would entail. Simply to make a distinction between, let's call it, panel of expert investigations into illicit arms transfers and public reports, which may or may not shame individuals or other actors who may be assumed to be behind illicit arms transfers, versus a less political, more focused issue on, as I said, situational awareness. Who are the actors? How are their capacities changing? And these elements. So really, just to finish on the recommendation, more awareness raising and building support from within the UN, including UN headquarters, the UN Secretariat, may be helpful for peacekeeping missions also to become more involved. And lastly, yes, of course, it would also be helpful to have such guidance more specifically in the mandates of peacekeeping missions. And I think there was an initiative by the government of Mexico in December 21 on this issue. And hopefully that will happen. I would still maintain, though, that even without mandate changes in some cases, issues like situational awareness and fight or contribution to the fight against impunity are certainly, as I understand it, part of what we UN peacekeeping missions may aim for. So greater awareness raising may help, and greater understanding on decision makers, what the implications are, to also allay the fears that none of this work has to be in terms of sensationalist naming and shaming of individual actors who may or may not be responsible for contributions to illicit arms transfers. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Nils. And I think you've described, some very important work there, and unfortunately, probably, as you said, also some work that is not necessarily always replicated across all the UN missions, as MINUSMA does have quite a capacity there that may not be available to others. Douglas, I see you have a hand raised. Unfortunately, I think we cannot take sort of questions from the participants as in view of the number of participants, unless they're in the Q&A. Did you want to type that quickly into the question and answer box? Or is one of my colleagues able to unmute? I would turn here to Erica or Lauren to see. Douglas, I'm guessing the best thing would be if you could put this into use the question and answer function to ask your question, then I will put that to Nils. But Nils, just Sorry,
Simon, just quickly, if we wanted to hand the floor to Douglas, we can unmute him to take the floor.
Okay, Douglas, then very quickly, if you don't mind, I'm happy to give you the floor. Thank you. Douglas, I'm afraid I'm not hearing you. So maybe we'll move on. I notice there's a question from Olivia, or maybe more a comment, saying that there were considerations further to an Area formula meeting on small arms and light weapons in September 2021 by the Security Council to establish small arms component in peacekeeping operations going forward. This could be an entry point for integration of arms, ammunition arms control into UN peace operations or UN architectures. And a question to colleagues, how far has this gone in the UN? I don't know if Gao or Nils may have an answer to this. If not, we may, Olivia, get back to you on that one. But let me see if colleagues have or wanted to respond to that one. I'm not seeing any mics being unmuted, so I'm guessing the answer is no. Olivia, let's see if we can get you a response to that in the coming days. What I would say is, knowing how the UN works, September 2021 is not very far away as for the UN system. And I think this is a welcome initiative. How much it has managed to actually be put into practice yet is probably quite doubtful, as we are an organization that works incredibly slowly, unfortunately.
But maybe Simon, just to complement, I think Nils in his presentation mentioned this and basically gave the answer. So I mean, in the end, the establishment of such a component would need to be mandated, right? So it's not up to the UN, as in the Secretariat and program funds and agencies, etc., to do that. But it would need to be mandated. But as mentioned by Nils, there are other ways to use the existing mandates and capacity and resources to work on these issues. And I think he provided quite an interesting overview. Thanks.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks for that. We have a question from Ariane, which is very much to do with, I'd say, broader peacekeeping. And maybe, Ariane, if you don't mind, Nils, maybe we can come back to this one, or you can come back to this one separately with Ariane. It's, do local economic interests in Mali overpower the UN peacekeeping efforts? I don't want to get onto a too broader discussion on UN peacekeeping or Mali at the moment. I'd rather we keep this sort of more focused on the toolkit if we can today. Ariane, my apologies for that, but we're happy to put you in touch, maybe with Nils if he's willing to have a go at that one separate from this. Nils, thank you for that. And Kojo Kwesi, you mentioned that the AU is engaged in peace enforcement in Somalia and occasionally disarms al-Shabaab. Arms control, therefore, appears to be different from regular peacekeeping operation. The conversation around arms control, therefore, ought to extend to include peace enforcement operations. More of a comment than a question, but I think I would agree with you. We look at, with the Arms-Related Risk Analysis Toolkit, at how we integrate arms control throughout every stage of a conflict, which includes during a conflict, and therefore as a part of operations that may be either peacekeeping, trying to keep a peace, or, and I have to say, much lesser extent, but I think you'll still find this is relevant there for those that are looking at peace enforcement. Although I do find the idea of bringing peace by force, I think some may say it's a little bit of an oxymoron, but we do have to try and do that. It is often, I'd say, the preliminary step to trying to reach hopefully a more negotiated agreement. Thank you. Maybe we move on very quickly to our last presenter, because I'm aware that we are slightly behind time already. And that would be Florence. Florence from Kumquake United Nations office. So Florence, I hope we can have a UN related but non-UN perspective on this here, and very glad to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I will have a non-UN perspective, but I will speak to the fact that there are bits of the UN other than what we've talked about here that could be relevant for the toolkit. So I might cheat and sort of jumble up the questions and then also twist the framing of the toolkit. So apologies in advance. I'll try to stick to time as well. So I know that the imminent scope of the toolkit is on conflict analysis, but I'd rather go a step further and really stretch to the margins of the continuum that was mentioned by Simon and Erica, and also zoom out from conflict per se and say that it can and should be used as a tool to help include arms-related risks in all contexts, universalizing its preventative potential, to go beyond prevention of violence per se to prevention of violations, full stop. So my key message being is that it is critical to understand that the presence and use of arms are both the cause and the consequence of human rights violations and the grievances that were mentioned earlier today in some of the conversations, and that it is critical to therefore leverage the complementarity between all pillars of the UN. Perhaps my voice here is to say, particularly between the arms control and the human rights communities of practice, to ensure a holistic approach, including to arms-related risks activities, and ultimately to prevent and reduce harm through pertinent and sustained engagement within communities. So the toolkit is an interesting tool to do both those things in approaching those communities of practice, to lean into each other's approaches and understandings, but also beyond those communities for all stakeholders to better understand arm-related impacts in the settings that they're operating in. So now for the longer version of that message. So while intuitively we might think that arms-related risks or impacts are most salient in places of war or high levels of destructive violence, we would be mistaken. The transfer of weapons and their presence in any society and their acquisition by civilians manifesting by hyper-militarized environments, or indeed by high-level police presence, daily military presence in public spaces, or their acquisition by civilians legally or illegally, has an impact on how societies function, has an impact of where power lies and how rights are enjoyed. So yes, of course, it also has an impact on the likelihood of how violence breaks out and heightens that likelihood by a margin. But just to highlight that they do have an impact on all sorts of ways in which a society functions. So this goes from affecting the right to life, obviously, which was mentioned earlier, but also the gender dynamics, for example, or the likelihood of femicide being a factor rather than simply violence in a household, or accessing education, or simply the freedom of movement that people can enjoy within a city or within their own country. Conversely, violations of human rights and the accumulations of those grievances are also drivers of conflict and armed violence if those weapons are available. And so ensuring that arms-related impacts are part of a horizon scan and that the drivers and impacts of arms flows are acknowledged is critical to understanding a context and to having a holistic analysis of the challenges that it harbors in that context, regardless of the stakeholders' own particular interest in that context or engagement as an expert organization. So indeed, indeed, we need to look at communities and the lived experiences of individuals holistically, in particular, but not only in relation to violence prevention, by collaborating across perceived silos, which ensures a comprehensive and intersectional approach. So you might think that from a pacifist organization like CUNO, we might now call for the total eliminations of arms, but that's not where I'm going with this. I think the toolkit can be first and foremost a step in the right direction to reduce the worst harm, to better understand that weapons have and not may have simply an impact on societies and their lived experiences. We've heard from colleagues here today on how this could be used at the operational level. So let me zoom out a little bit out of the country level analysis that we've heard to the multilateral spaces that CUNO engages here in Geneva, bringing this idea of also folding in the human rights community into the conversations on arms. I would argue that the toolkit could be a hook and a leverage to approaching other communities of practice here in Geneva, and in particular the human rights sphere. Here I'm thinking about special procedures, mandate holders, investigative bodies, or treaty bodies of the Human Rights Council. This is not to say that the human rights community hasn't really thought about the impacts of weapons. It has, but in a more ad hoc and potentially also tentative basis. I believe this is due to a lack of understanding of arms-related impacts on various human rights, and also perhaps also the siloization of the work that we do, not having the reach to the correct networks to get some of that information, and the perceived technical experience or expertise required to do so. Here, the toolkit, of course, is part of that solution, signposting relevant actors to those seeking for information. There are already ongoing efforts to fill that gap that the toolkit could lean into, reach out to. So, for example, the Human Rights Council has 2 resolutions relevant to this work, one on arms transfers and another one on civilian acquisition led by Ecuador and Peru. There's also much work being done around the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, who have mentioned in various reviews of different states the impact of weapons on the lived experiences of women. There are also other organizations that have worked on this. So, for example, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Another couple of examples would be the FFM on Myanmar, which mentioned arms transfers as a salient factor in the conflict there. And the Business and Human Rights Working Group is currently developing an information note on the defense sector. So these are all places within the human rights community that could be useful to reach out to continue leveraging, and more systematically so, the human rights mechanisms in relation to weapons. So worth noting here as well is that in leaning into the human rights community, you probably also do a little bit more of the upstreaming of that prevention work that you mentioned earlier, Erica. And the other added value of the human rights mechanisms is that they provide a roadmap for implementation long-term, rather than at the sort of crisis moment where a lot of this analysis might take place in different mission settings. And this could be through the Universal Periodic Review, for example, if more arms control actors would be encouraged to also be reporting back to that mechanism. But back to the toolkit, perhaps, as it's part of the puzzle towards actually demystifying arms controls and arm-related risks by providing part of that understanding, the networks to do so, and making it accessible. Perhaps the first step is to make it a little bit shorter. But jokes aside, I think it's a really helpful tool to actually raise the awareness of arms control as a sector and as a non-technical sector. I think it's really important. For example, the Business and Human Rights Information Note that I mentioned earlier is really striving to actually reach out to arms control communities. So it goes both ways as well. And I think the toolkit can be one of those vectors to have communication going both ways between those communities of practice. And as for CUNO's own part in this, we're really part of a larger network of people, including OHCHR and PBSO, who are trying to connect New York and Geneva. And I think other colleagues on this call also would agree with me that I think that's also part of the challenge, is to connect the UN within itself. And I would happily assist in any way, shape or form to connect at least the toolkit to the human rights communities that I'm in touch with, but also to see what could be done more at the PBSO and the PBF level. And I think that's it from me to keep to a short presentation and enable a little bit more of the Q&A.
Lawrence, thank you very much for that. A lot to think about there, and I you know, when we developed the toolkit, it was very much, I think, focused on probably the UN sort of more traditional conflict prevention, or I'd say armed conflict prevention. But you're quite right. There is you know, hopefully it is useful to other actors out there who are looking at not only preventing violence, but as you so eloquently put it, preventing violations. I'd like to say that the toolkit itself, as I said, looks at the use of weapons in different stages of conflict, including, you know, sort of before and after, where a lot of the violence may not be, I'd say, political armed violence, but could also be criminal or even domestic and others. And there are some indicators around this to try and, you know, look at some of these issues and these measures and say, you know, what does this mean for a society and for the trajectory of that society, especially as regards, you know, how does it undermine maybe some of the pillars of society that could then lead to make it more vulnerable to other types of conflict, including armed conflict. So I think point very well taken there. We do need to reach out to these other actors, and I hope they would find that there is something of interest and of use already in the toolkit. But I should stop talking and see if anyone else wanted to make a point or raise their hand figuratively. I think Douglas, I think it was you who had raised a hand before. I don't know if you would like to try and come in now with your question, or if we can bring that in now. No. Then I do note that we have a question from Sani Adamu, who, thank you, Sami. He commends UNIDIR for launching the toolkit and wanted to ask what role we have for regional organizations like ECOWAS in the uptake of the toolkit and stepping up the uptake of the toolkit by member states. I might also ask other colleagues from UNIDIR to come in on this, but Sani, I would say that we are very much hoping that, that this is a tool that will be taken up by other organizations, by regional organizations. ECOWAS, of course, is one that sort of leads the way in a lot of respects with their early warning capacity that they have set up, but also a number of regional and other initiatives on arms control. And so I would very much hope that they would find a lot of interest in this. And we have colleagues in West Africa who are working very closely with ECOWAS and who no doubt will be looking with them to see how they may be able to use this and how they might adapt it, both at a regional but also at a member state level. And so the answer is, I'd say it's probably still ongoing, but it's certainly something that we have considered. And I think ECOWAS is a key or a prime partner for this in view of the work that they've already done in both the fields of arms control and of conflict prevention, and especially early warning. I see we have a hand up from Sienna, who I know I'd also been warned would probably like to make an intervention. So unless there are any other questions, and I'm not seeing any more in the Q&A, happy to hand the floor over to you, Sienna. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And thanks also to Erica, to Nils, to Florence, and to Gaho, of course, for your interventions today. I'll just be very brief. From the perspective of the DPO ODA initiative on weapons and ammunition management in DDR processes, I just wanted to point out the complementarities that Gahu has also touched upon. You know, at the core of both of these initiatives, there is an aim to really maximize the capacity of arms control, disarmament, and WAM to promote and bolster peacekeeping, peacebuilding, conflict prevention, and stabilization efforts. And both initiatives, of course, do so in a way that develops practicable tools for practitioners, whether they be you know, a policy analyst or a political analyst in a JMAC cell to a DDR practitioner in a peacekeeping mission, to really integrate disarmament efforts and design, even if there is not a strong backing and expertise of arms control. So I think these efforts to join the dots and to bridge sectors are very welcome. And we've been very happy to be engaged with Erica and Manu in these efforts, and just very happy to listen and to learn today. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Hello?
Hi, Simon. We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Sorry about that. I had problems unmuting, which 3 years into a pandemic and Zoom, everyone should know how to do automatically, but I still haven't learned. But thank you for that, Jana. And I'm glad to hear that this collaboration and cooperation is ongoing, and very much look forward to keeping it going and to expanding it, although I leave that in the hands of my colleagues in Geneva and New York. We are almost at the end of the session. I'm just wondering if there are any further questions that people might want to raise from the floor. If not, I would look to start to close up the session, or if there are any other comments from panelists on this. What I would say, for those of you who haven't yet had an opportunity to do so, please do visit the website. The tool is available there. It is downloadable. As Florence mentioned, it is quite big and long, and I think we do need to see how we can refine it or further make it hopefully more usable. But the idea was to try and get a comprehensive tool out there that may be useful for actors in all different contexts and all different stages of a conflict, if you would like, as we felt it was important to try and address this as holistically as possible and make it as usable to everyone. Florence, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, and perhaps just to sort of respond to the sort of little comment I put on the length, I think it's also a question of how you want to use it and with the different communities of practice where it might be useful. I think you're right to have a comprehensive tool, and then perhaps to spin off some of the products depending on who you're talking to. I think it would be interesting to explore how it could be useful to a human rights community, perhaps not in its entirety, because some bits might not be completely relevant to the different mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, perhaps. But I'm sure that in conversation with some of these entities, you might find that a spin-off version or a two-pager version, while perhaps a bit tokenistic as a two-pager, might already spur enough interest to get some of the thought process going.
Great, thank you. It's definitely something to consider. The idea was, as I said, to keep it comprehensive, but we also, I think, hopefully made very clear in the toolkit that that a lot of it may not be applicable to everyone, and therefore it is very much up to the analyst to pick and choose which fields they think might be the most suitable for their context. And we've tried to make that as easy as possible, including, as was mentioned by Erica, by putting in as many sources of information as possible, although there are often many local sources for ones relating to a country or a region that are not mentioned there because they'd be too many to do so. But we have heard today, and thank you to the panelists, I think quite a bit about the toolkit. You know, I'm glad to hear that it is something that is welcomed, that it is a recognition that arms are an instrument to enable armed violence, and you know that there are arms-related risks, both in, as Florence said, you know, in conflict, but also in Florence, I've forgotten how you'd put it, in violence, and also in violations. The fact that this is something that we had looked at for analysts, and as Gail mentioned, for who are often sort of political actors, is it's something that we had sort of looked at almost specifically, understanding that this was done by people who don't necessarily have, well, the analysis is done by people who don't necessarily have a background in arms control. But there is also, I think, as Florence mentioned, a clear need to try and expand this beyond the sort of the audience that we'd initially looked at, which may have been those engaged in political analysis and political conflict analysis, if you would like. As we heard, in Mali, there are within the UN certainly some, I think, quite strong resources to look at arms control, but these, as was mentioned, and the reference to the initiative by, I believe it was Mexico and the Security Council, these are not always available to everyone, and certainly vary within peace operations, including within peacekeeping operations. The ability to look at arms control is there in very varying degrees. What we have done here is try to bring a tool that is accessible even when you may not have some of that specialist expertise that was mentioned by Nils. Some of the very technical issues around tracing of weapons and ammunition. And so we're hoping that this provides an entry point for all, even when that expertise is not available. But of course, it would be, I think, it would have a much stronger impact if it were able to be used alongside some of the more technical capacities that may come into operations as we move forward. Florence, you mentioned the issue of militarization society, of the types of violence. As I said, we have tried to look at this within the toolkit as well, and take that beyond sort of political armed conflict to look at other types of armed violence, or violence involving small arms and light weapons and conventional arms. And I think what we've heard from all of the panelists today in the examples cited is that conventional arms, and this is not a surprise to anyone, remain the main tool of violence in most of the contexts in which we're working, and therefore they do deserve, I think, particular attention, and that's what we have tried to do through this tool. There is a need to, as was said, and I like the term, to demystify arms control. possibly by starting to make the tool shorter, as you said, Florence. But in itself, it is a step in that direction. Maybe we can lift another veil by making it shorter and more accessible even than it is at the moment. That'll be for the next stage. I think the important point, and really this is a plea to all of you who have attended today, is that the arms control, the toolkit that we brought out is this is a first stage in the process. We would love to hear from you as to what you think about it. We'd like to hear if you are using it, how useful it is. And we would certainly like to hear, beyond make it shorter, what is, what could be changed to make it more useful, more accessible, what may be missing, what may be superfluous. Basically, how can we improve this as we go forward? It's important for us, as was mentioned by Simon in his opening remarks, that this is not just a kit that rests on the web, or for those of you who have the temerity to print it out and put it on your bookshelves, that remains on a shelf and is never used. It is important for us that this is a practical tool and that it is used, and we would love to hear from you as you take it forward. I'm just looking at the time, and I see that we're just over time, so I will just take a minute to say thank you to all. Again, thank you especially to the panelists, to the United Kingdom and to Simon in particular for attending the event. This is, as I said, a first step. We look forward to hearing from you as we go forwards. We encourage you all to be in contact with UNIDIR with follow-up questions. And if you have any questions on how to use the toolkit, if you have any comments on using it, we would love to hear from you. So we hope that today's meeting is the first of, or the start of a discussion around this, I would say, and that it will provide you all with an opportunity to consider more broadly how to integrate conventional arms control into conflict prevention. Thank you again, and I wish you all a good afternoon, a good morning for those in New York, and a good evening for those of you who may be in, let me see, further east of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot,
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.